This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. I'm your co-host together with Gilad, and we'll be talking every week about books and ideas and other important things. Our guest today has been making waves with his new book. He is Nathan Thrall. He's a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group, for which he has covered Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza since 2010. His writing has also appeared in Foreign Affairs, GQ, The New Republic, and The New York Times, among other publications. Nathan's book is called The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine, published by Metropolitan Books in 2017. In the book, he argues essentially that only pressure of various kinds has ever worked to advance peace or extract concessions in this conflict. It's a controversial thesis, and he's here to explain it to us. Nathan Thrall, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You analyze how and why negotiations and diplomacy have failed, painstakingly so, and that only pressure and force work. But it seems like everything has been tried in a way. War, negotiations, everything in between. And by many of your analyses, the situation of the Palestinians has probably never been worse. And you document that meticulously, too. So what does working mean in this context when you say pressure works? What does work mean?
Yeah. So, if we look at the history of this conflict, what we see is incremental progress. And we live now at a time of peak despair, I think, about this conflict. And nearly every analyst talks about a one-state reality or some leap from that to say the inevitability of a one-state outcome. And I think that a lot of that is myopic, and it's born of frustration with Netanyahu. But if we take a step back and we really look at things historically, things have changed a great deal in terms of what the solution is that the international community envisages. It's not so long ago that no one was talking about Palestinian statehood. That's a recent development. It's a recent development that the United States made it official policy that they're in favor of a Palestinian state. It's a recent development that the United Nations Security Council, has called explicitly for a Palestinian state. It's a recent development that Israeli prime ministers have come to understand that there is no deal without giving Palestinians territory equivalent to what was conquered in 1967 in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So what I see is actually convergence on both sides. It's slow, it's halting, it's frustrating, but I see that tremendous progress has been made, and the two sides are actually much closer to a two-state outcome than they've ever been. And in fact, we really want to talk about a one-state reality. Was it more of a one-state reality between 1967 and 1987 or today? To me, there's no question. Israelis were going and shopping in Nablus and Gaza and vice versa. In a way, it's a hopeful book that I do think that progress will continue to be made. I do think that we are actually headed toward increasing autonomy for Palestinians, increasing territorial control for Palestinians. Whether it's actually going to result in something that you and I would feel ready to call a Palestinian state is a different question.
So do you attribute this progress to the onset of violence and pressure? What's your analysis here regarding the pressure that Dahlia mentioned earlier?
Yeah, in many instances, yes. But I look at each case specifically. I look in the book at every Israeli territorial withdrawal. And not all of those came about through violence, but all of them came about through pressure of one kind or another. And yes, I do think it's a big taboo in this conflict to talk about violence being efficacious, because one is assumed to be advocating it then. Anyway, it's clear why anybody would want to say that it's not efficacious, because no one wants violence, and we don't want to say that something works if it's an outcome we don't desire.
All right, so conversely, do you attribute the current stalemate that we've seen for the past, 8 years throughout Netanyahu's premiership at least, do you attribute that to the absence of pressure of any kind?
Yes. I do.
But we've seen so much force over the last number of years. We've had 3 wars. We've had these ongoing spates of lone wolf violence. I mean, there's been so much death just by the numbers. Actually, some of the data coming out now points to massive gaps in the number of people who were killed in the early years of the occupation relative to the last 10, 20 years. That's a lot of force going in both directions, physical force. So why haven't we seen more progress according to your general thesis?
First of all, I would separate the Gaza wars that have occurred since Israel withdrew from Gaza. Israel has no reason to believe that, well, let me put it differently. Palestinians fighting from Gaza have no hope of getting a withdrawal from the West Bank by having wars with Israel from Gaza, especially if those wars, as they have been so far, have been limited to Gaza. I mean, the West Bank has been more or less silent during those wars. Israel has withdrawn from Gaza. It's possible that some of the force that comes from Gaza can result in different outcomes. We can have another war and a ceasefire out of that war where Palestinians are given port or some of these plans that have been put forward in recent years. And by the way, I mean, we do see, in fact, that out of these Gaza wars, now everybody is talking about how it's inevitable that there's going to be another, and oughtn't we prevent it by changing the situation in Gaza for the better, including by creating some kind of sea transit for Gazans that's not totally controlled by Israel.
But so far that seems quite remote, and what you could look at in the sense that we've had a sequence of 3 wars and possibly another, it could also be argued that war begets war.
That war begets war?
Yeah. In other words, we had 1 war in Gaza that led to a second, that led to a third, and maybe a fourth that everybody's talking about.
Yeah.
And there haven't been so many relaxations. I mean, just very minimal.
I think that's why I say Gaza has to be separated out, because Gaza, the withdrawal has already happened. And so what can be negotiated with wars from Gaza are changes in the nature of the restrictions. After some of these conflicts, Israel has agreed that Gaza fishermen can go to change the limits on how much Gazans can go in the buffer areas and so forth. Those things have all occurred, but essentially the situation is one of Israel controlling Gaza from outside and having no desire to go back in. I mean, to return to the original question, I would separate Gaza out, and then looking at the violence of the last couple of years, which you mentioned, these lone wolf attacks. I mean, what we did see, in fact, this was largely centered in Jerusalem. For the first time, we saw polls showing 2/3 of Israelis talking about wanting to withdraw from Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. And now we have proposals being submitted to the prime minister that he is apparently not disavowing and saying that he's considering, that are for various forms of withdrawal from parts of East Jerusalem. I think that actually fits the thesis very well.
But I have to take a little bit of issue with that. I mean, I am, proper disclosure, in my general real life, a pollster.
Yes.
And I would say that there's the context of those polls is that the person who proposed them is the head of the opposition party, Labor, that proposed those withdrawing from Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. He's nowhere near a position of power. You and I noticed that headline because we're following it. I think most Israelis never paid any attention to it. And what was asked in the poll was specifically about getting rid of a bunch of Palestinian neighborhoods. It was unrelated to the kinds of solutions that are considered a workable part of a 2-state solution, which involve really dividing Jerusalem in different ways. So it was very hypothetical, almost unnoticed, and the person who would advocate that is in no position of power to do it. So how much does that count as an actual potential concession? You know, which brings me to a bigger point that some of the other concessions you talk about, how much are they really concessions? I mean, even the Gaza withdrawal. Many would argue that Gaza has simply become, as a result, an open-air prison, that it put the Palestinian peace process on hold, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So are we really getting concessions out of force, or are we getting stalling tactics?
Well, there's every reason to be cynical and skeptical about the motives behind the changes. But you ask yourself objectively, what is the change? The change, in essence, there's more confrontation from Palestinians. Occupation becomes more difficult. Israel looks for a way to renegotiate arrangements with the Palestinians, to quiet them, to lessen the confrontation. Yes, to make occupation easier. Of course, that is the goal. But what happens out of that process is incremental changes that have totally reshaped the reality in the West Bank and Gaza, such that An alien who comes down in 1970 looks and sees one state, and an alien who comes down today sees no Israelis in Gaza, no Israeli settlements in Gaza, no Israelis in Area A, a Palestinian foreign ministry building in Ramallah that looks brand new and shiny, and all kinds of other new Palestinian Authority buildings going up in governorates throughout the West Bank, which goes to show you, of course, the emptiness of all of the threats of dismantling the Palestinian Authority, which is another aside. I don't have a problem acknowledging that what this has been so far is reshaping and remolding occupation and making it easier to sustain. That's the goal. But there's no denying that those changes have been changes that have given Palestinians greater autonomy and changed how this place is run on the ground.
But it doesn't mean, I'd like to challenge you on this for a bit longer. I mean, your whole thesis is premised on the understanding that concessions, to an extent, equal progress. Bettering the situation on the ground for the peace process in general. And these concessions, the Gaza withdrawal being case in point, in a way not only perpetuate but even entrench the occupation in a way that takes us away from the end goal. What can you say? Do you see concessions as equal to progress?
I mean, obviously, concession is not the exact same thing as progress, right? But the nature of the concessions that have come have been all in the direction of moving toward the international community's vision of the end state here, of two states on the 67 lines.
Let me ask you about another major part of your thesis, because I would say one side of it is that pressure and force works, and the other side of it is the incentive structure, the sort of failure of incentives coming from the international community or other kinds of arguments that be considered positive incentives for both sides, but particularly the stronger side in the conflict to move ahead. What are the kinds of incentives that you look at that haven't managed to work, and why haven't they worked?
I'm just going to take a second to add a point to the earlier thing because I was thinking about that as you were talking. Let me just remember what I was going to say. Regarding the withdrawal from Gaza, everyone in the world can quote Doobie Weissglass and say it was all intended to freeze the peace process forever. And
it was Ariel Sharon's chief of staff, we should say.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And everybody can talk about how it was all a crafty way for Israel to control this and continue this and the other. The fact is, for the Palestinian national movement to have achieved a piece of territory in mandatory Palestine that they control without Israeli troops inside, without Israeli settlers inside, is a historic thing. And I don't think that the cynicism about Israeli goals detracts from that.
If we're on that point, I think the point that I was trying to make is not only about what was intended, but actually how Gaza is controlled. And the UN, of course, in their report on the last Gaza war, declared it under effective control of Israel still, because Israel controls, as you so well know, the borders and the crossings and the airspace and population registry, everything other than Rafah, and even that to some extent. So it's a matter of also what Israel actually still does about Gaza today, even if not inside Gaza.
Without a doubt. But does Israel control Gaza more today than it did when its troops were inside Gaza, patrolling inside Gaza City when tanks were going around in Gaza City? Obviously, the control is much less. Obviously, Palestinians encounter Israel much less. Now, they're screwed in all kinds of different ways. Egypt is screwing them now. They're locked in. But they are under less Israeli control than they were when Israel was there.
But this didn't bring us closer to the endgame. Actually, if you look at the effect of the Gaza disengagement on Israeli public opinion, let alone the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, it has taken us 20 years back to the levels of distrust that were prevalent back then. Now, I know that in your book you tend to downplay, and in my opinion rightfully so, the role that distrust played in preventing us from making any kind of headway. But regardless of the practicalities of the occupation and the control of the Palestinians, this is really what we should be looking at when we're discussing, again, making progress, getting closer to the end game.
As you rightly say, I'm skeptical that a lack of trust is an obstacle to achieving peace. And I don't buy into the argument that absence of trust has been responsible for past failures. If we look since Israel withdrew from Gaza, and you have all of the rockets and all of the wars, and it was such a disaster, and what a horrible mistake, how many Israelis want to go back and reoccupy Gaza today?
But the level of distrust is not only about Israelis wanting or not wanting to reoccupy Gaza, it's also about what it's done to Palestinian society. In other words, created an enormous wedge and separation, in addition, augmented by Israeli policies of separation. And maybe that also has been a factor that's eroding the Palestinian ability to envision itself as a state.
I mean, Israel obviously is just as capable of enforcing a separation policy between Gaza and the West Bank when it's in Gaza as it is when it's outside Gaza.
Can't argue with that. Let's go back to the incentive question.
Yes.
I want to understand how you analyze the incentives on both sides to make concessions and move ahead towards some sort of a political resolution. Why have they failed up until now?
I think that there has been a real emphasis on carrots throughout the last quarter century of negotiations. What kinds of incentives, positive incentives, can we hold out to the parties? This was a major feature of the Obama administration's strategy under Kerry. He began his process talking about the billions he was going to get for the West Bank, which never materialized. Europeans have offered upgrades in status to Israel. Israel has known since 2002 that full peace with the Palestinians means a full peace with the entire Arab world.
Because of the Arab Peace Initiative.
Because of the Arab Peace Initiative. And I do not believe that the missing ingredient has been insufficient carrots. I think the missing ingredient has been insufficient sticks.
Why aren't those carrots enough?
Well, the carrots aren't enough because let's just examine the choice for an Israeli prime minister. You can, on one hand, decide not to sign a deal. Let's not worry about the details for now, but let's say a deal along the lines of the Clinton parameters of 2000. So that's choice one. You don't do that. What consequences do you face? Basically none. Some recriminations in the press, and you'll have this battle with the Palestinians of who is at fault. Different advocates will go on CNN and blame the other side. But basically everything stays the same, which is to say that you have full control of the West Bank, inside the West Bank, along the border with Jordan, and control of Gaza from without. And you've really not disrupted anything politically inside of Israel because there isn't a strong demand to have signed that agreement, and everyone will believe you if you say that I didn't sign it because the other side is not a partner or their demands were unreasonable. So electorally, it just makes no sense to choose that option when you compare it to the alternative. And the alternative option is make this agreement. You face enormous upheaval in Israel. Maybe it doesn't even go through. Now we should probably talk about some of those details because any realistic agreement is going to have concessions in it that are going to cause tremendous turmoil within Israel, probably the biggest political upheaval that the country has faced. And you have the possibility of violence, Jew-on-Jew violence within Israel. And of course you have, by definition, less control of the Palestinian population. However, whatever limitations on sovereignty you put on that Palestinian state, it's going to be less control than Israel has today. Okay, now let's look at those carrots. But on the other hand, you're going to get those carrots.
What are the sticks that you think should have been applied?
Or could be.
Well, just to finish the thought, to complete the comparison, you could say, okay, well, all of that's very, very bad. And clearly, if you were just comparing those two, it's better to just not have the deal. But you have these carrots. And what are the carrots? A slight upgrade in ties with Europe.
Which is already Israel's biggest trade partner.
Already Israel's biggest trade partner. You've killed the BDS movement.
Which isn't really all that powerful.
Which isn't all that powerful. It hasn't made a dent in Israel's economy. You now have officially peace with the Arab states who are all eager to be doing business with you, as is today behind the scenes. So the benefits aren't that great either.
So one of the things that you point out is that Israel is already the top recipient of American foreign aid, which totals more than the second and third country combined, I think is what you point out in the book. I mean, maybe there's an issue here of at least the Israeli side and to some extent the Palestinian side, which is also largely existing on donor money, getting the milk for free.
Yes, the U.S. government has been really unwilling to do more than scold Israel. And I think that that's been part of the frustration for me as an analyst in talking to U.S. officials. I genuinely got the feeling from people in the Obama administration and people around Kerry, they really thought that it was a matter of convincing Israel that this was an inevitable choice that it was going to have to confront and that it's in its own interest. And it was just a matter of persuading Israel forcefully enough. Of course, you don't need sticks because it's so logical. And one of the kind of driving motives of the book was to explain that that's not the case. And it's not the case in large part because there are no consequences from the U.S. It's not backed up by action. All you're going to face as an Israeli prime minister from the U.S. is some scolding.
Maybe that is because the United States foreign policy in the Middle East, supporting Israel is a much higher priority than ushering an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal.
Yes.
I mean, just look at it soberly and say, this is what the United States foreign policy has been for decades now. Why should it change?
Yes. So I would say two things. One is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much a domestic issue in the United States, and that has a lot to do with why the U.S. behaves in the way that it does. But if we leave that aside and we don't include that in the argument, I am a person who actually believes that a cold and sober analysis of the conflict from a narrow U.S. perspective is that the strategic benefits of forcing a deal in Israel and Palestine and creating a strategically inconsequential Palestinian state and having a fight with Israel and forget about all the fight in Congress and everything else, it's simply not worth it. And there's not a lot to be gained, particularly when the Arab states now are all telling you, we see eye to eye with Israel on everything except the Palestinian issue.
So can we go back to Gilad's question about what are the kinds of pressure sticks, I guess, that could be undertaken in this conflict if America were to change its approach, defying what you consider a rather realpolitik analysis and say, we actually do think it's important now to get to a two-state solution or a negotiated agreement. We realize argumentation is not going to work. Here is our version of pressure. What would it be?
I should also say, in response to Gilad's question, is that the U.S. officials themselves constantly do say and act as though it's a priority for them to resolve this conflict. But I agree that deserves sober analysis, and it shouldn't just be assumed.
To look beyond the rhetoric. Yeah.
Which I think we need to do in the case of the local leaders as well. Both Israelis and Palestinians, really. There's a big distinction between what they say and what they do.
I want to hear about the sticks.
Yes. So obviously, one of the major sticks that the U.S. has is that it is giving more military assistance to Israel than to the rest of the world combined. That's an astonishing fact. And there is a tremendous power in that. There is tremendous power in the fact that the United States defends Israel in every international institution and especially at the UN. If the world felt that the U.S.'s position were changing and that cover was no longer there, things would change very quickly for Israel. If European banks were no longer to do business with any Israeli institutions that operate or have dealings with the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that would have an enormous impact. If your average Israeli suddenly realizes that I have new visa restrictions on travel to Europe, that would have a large impact. But what we're talking about are things that are in outer space right now.
Sure. But what makes you think that it would make Israelis more pliable to making concessions? Why do you think it won't create the opposite effect and make Israelis more defiant? I think that if there's one case that really, in a way, contradicts or challenges that premise, is the Palestinians. I mean, they've been on the receiving end of so much political pressure and being completely left to their own devices diplomatically for so long, yet it didn't make them less defiant. I mean, even more if you look at Hamas compared to the Palestinian Authority.
Although the book outlines the various concessions, ideological concessions the Palestinians have made along the way.
Sure, but still, for the past 25 years, they've stuck to the bare minimum of what they want to achieve out of peace negotiation with Israel, even though Israel has been trying consistently to negotiate on that.
I would say yes and no. I mean, first of all, as Dalia was saying, the Palestinians have made enormous concessions as a result of pressure. They were put under severe pressure to accept Resolution 242, which they refused to do for years and years and years, and they finally caved with tremendous pressure applied to them, including military defeats. And then, subsequent to that, the idea of limited autonomy, which was an idea that Begin raised in December of 1977. That's something they refused for 15 years and finally accepted with tremendous pressure, including the self-inflicted wound of their behavior during the First Gulf War.
You're talking about the Oslo.
No.
Yes, I'm talking about Oslo. Yeah. This is something that they rejected for many years.
But it's temporary. I mean, they don't accept it as it's become eternal, but when they accepted it, it was on a temporary basis.
But it had always been described as a temporary thing. Then there would be a referendum. It was never going to be being asked to accept permanent limited autonomy. So I think that the Palestinians are an example of the efficacy of pressure.
So do you think if this goes on, they will show more flexibility on Jerusalem, on the right of return, on issues that have been really taboo for them for so long?
Absolutely. And not only do I think that, but I see that that's already been the case. I do not think that their demands today are the same as their demands 25 years ago.
But you started out talking about Israel. Why would we assume that this kind of political and economic pressure on Israel would force Israel to make concessions?
Yes.
We've never experienced exactly those kinds of serious pressure on Israel. How do we know?
Well, behind closed doors, we have. I mean, we saw in the final days of the Camp David summit was Carter applying enormous pressure, including threatening the withholding of U.S. aid to Israel. And it was only out of that conversation that Begin finally agreed, which was the sticking point during that summit, agreed to withdraw settlements from Sinai and recognize that Resolution 242 applied also to the West Bank. These were two things he was absolutely unwilling to do, and he did when he faced a severe threat.
So since you raised Carter, I want to start wrapping up by asking a question about 2 weeks ago, we saw the death of one of Carter's most senior advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but Brzezinski. Yeah. He was among the architects of Carter's policy of pressuring Israel and really getting to these achievements. And Carter himself, of course, is getting older. Are we witnessing the end of an era where an American president, we can imagine an American president actually pressuring Israel? I mean, even with the unpredictability of the current presidency administration. What can we anticipate from America? Do we see anybody who's willing to undertake that kind of pressure and stand up to Israel in that way?
You know, as skeptical as I am about changes coming from the United States in the near term, there are long-term changes that are happening in the U.S. We have to remember that it was a very real possibility that Bernie Sanders could have been elected, and we would have seen, I think, a different policy. I don't want to overstate it. I don't think it would have been a radically different one, but it would have been a different policy. And the Democratic Party is changing. You do see these polls that are now showing not only a majority, but as much as 60% of Democrats who are in favor of sanctions or some other action against settlements. And, of course, in Trump, we have a totally unpredictable figure who I think frightens many Israelis precisely because they do think that unlike almost any other imaginable U.S. president, he is capable of waking up one day furious that Netanyahu is the obstacle to his achieving a historic agreement and isolating him and Israel.
Okay, I want to ask a last question that challenges, I think, one of the implicit premises of your book, which is that when you talk about the idea that pressure or force works, you kind of put together physical force, violence of wars, and political and economic pressure. Do you really think those two can be conflated in the sense that if we look at what happened, taking one example, the Second Intifada, one of the most violent phases in the history of this conflict, you can talk about certain kinds of concessions like the Gaza withdrawal, and we can argue whether they really advanced some sort of a negotiated settlement. But you can also say that Israelis responded by moving to the right, voting for right-wing governments, and they have never gone back. And the question is, maybe they will support certain piecemeal concessions, but they also change the political environment following waves of force basically make it look very inauspicious that an Israeli government will ever make the kinds of progress we're talking about here. Can force and political or economic pressure really be seen as one?
Clearly, they're two different things, but they are both types of coercion. And what I'm arguing is that coercion is effective, and it comes in many different forms. And I do think that the two often go hand in hand. So when we saw violence during the Second Intifada, violence peaking during the Second Intifada, we saw enormous diplomatic investment in trying immediately to resolve the conflict, including through coercion. It was out of the Second Intifada and the Saudi frustration with U.S. policy during the Second Intifada that they put unprecedented pressure on the United States and threatened a major rupture in U.S.-Saudi relations that brought about, actually, the U.S. commitment to make Palestinian statehood a matter of policy, which then resulted in Sharon during the Second Intifada, when everybody's supposedly turning to the right and moving in the opposite direction, making the concession of stating that he was in favor of a Palestinian state. Similarly, it was after the Second Intifada. It wasn't the case that everybody just turned to the right and never moved back.
You do not want me to start spouting numbers.
Okay, but let's just look at the election. Who did Israelis vote for? Who did they give a plurality of their vote for in 2006? To Ehud Olmert and the Kadima Party, who was running on a platform of completing what Sharon started in Gaza and withdrawing up to the security barrier in the West Bank. I don't think that this notion that anytime Israelis are confronted with pressure, they inevitably go to the right and it sets the conflict back is correct. And also, I don't put a ton of stock in opinion polls, and they're not the substance of my argument, and I don't base much on them. But even there, when we look at polling of Israelis during the Second Intifada on the Clinton parameters, which include dividing Jerusalem, sovereignty for the Palestinians over the Temple Mount, we see that peak support for it came when? In March 2002. So this was the kind of the bloodiest period of the Second Intifada, days after a major series of attacks.
I think we could go back and forth about this because I still feel like there's lots of phases of wars that we haven't talked about, like the 2006 war, which, yes, at that moment, Kadima was elected, but by 2009, we already had a right-wing government that has since been reelected every time. So I feel like there's lots of ways we could
Of course, and the best way to do it is to read Nathan's book, which is called The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine. Nathan Thrall, a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.